I suppose you could describe salinity like a cancer. It becomes first evident on top, but it's all happening underneath. It's all happened underneath. It's a very, very slow moving process, but once it does become evident, then you've really got the battle on your hands.
Very touchy subject, all these things. Some people accept it and some won't, you know.
Well, I don't know about round here. I know up on Murray River area that they have problems up there, but that's about all I know about it.
What it is actually, I wouldn't know.
Do you know how to identify it?
No, would never.
No, I think it's the whole of Australia's problem, isn't it, really? Because we've seem to have it everywhere.
I have heard people talking about it, but I'm not really sure what about it.
Oh, well, a blind man could see it, almost.
People are not, well, they don't have to survive off the land, so therefore I think, you know, in general, I think a lot are not concerned because, it doesn't really worry them, you know, if there's a bit of salt in the paddock, it doesn't mean that, you know, the sheep get less feed and all that.
Well, you plant more trees, you get rid of it. It's mainly the water table coming up through the ground that causes it. And at the moment around this area here, we've got a very high water table. So just the solution is to plant more trees.
Wouldn't have a clue.
Got no idea.
Would not have a clue. No. What is it?
Well, I suppose they soon will when everything stops growing. It's as simple as that. We only take notice of things when something happens.
And I mean, if I neglect it, if I neglect the land, the land's definitely going to neglect me.
Since European settlement, we can only be proud of our ancestors for developing Australia into a great nation. At first they were daunted by the great expanse of our continent, covered by one seemingly inexhaustible forest. As settlement grew, clearing of the land was encouraged and seen as essential for the expanding needs of rural production. Development meant that industry and mining had a fierce appetite for timber and used what appeared to be an unending supply. The growth of our nation has meant great changes to the landscape. Perennial woodlands and dense scrub once covered 90% of Victoria. 70% has now become transformed into a paddock landscape, consisting mostly of shallow-rooted pastures. This massive clearing has caused most of the vast salinity problems we have today. It's only recently that the severity of salinity has become evident. It's the single greatest environmental threat that Australia is facing. Salting is widespread across Victoria. What should have taken millions of years has taken 150 years. At present, it is estimated that 1.5% of land in Victoria is further damaged each year. If nothing is done, 75% of the state will be affected within the next 50 years. This year, $50 million worth of production loss occurred. It has been forecast in the next 10 years this cost may treble. Millions are spent and lost now, billions may be spent later. Few landholders are safe from it. No one will be unaffected, and there's still a lot of confusion to deal with.
Landholders are confused about salinity. There are varying levels of awareness throughout the state. There are some landholders who've lived with salinity for a long time and understand it very well and have moved into salinity control. There are other parts of the state where landholders are in a pre-problem stage. They don't recognise they've got a problem, and once they do recognise they've got a problem, they don't want to know about it. It frightens them. They feel that land values may drop as a result of recognising salinity, so there are all sorts of blocks. And over a number of years, people get out of that and into a far more positive phase.
There are three main types of salting in Victoria: irrigation salting, scald and dryland salting. Irrigation salting is most evident in the Murray-Darling Basin. Its cause is directly due to man, as it results from the application of more water than can be used by plants. Dryland salting means salting of non-irrigated land. Here we have the scald type, which occurs due to wind erosion exposing subsoils on the dry beds of old salt lakes. The third most common type is dryland salting. This occurs due to hillside seepage and valley floor or water table salting. Clearing is the main cause of salting. Water is often the invisible villain. we shall examine dry land salting as it is the most likely to affect Haddon and its surrounding shires.
The Salt Watch program conducted at Haddon Primary School was part of a statewide project where school children were asked to collect samples of water from their home surroundings, bring them to school, and then an officer from CFNL attended to analyse the water for its salt content. The data was then collected and put on computer, and the information was then forwarded to Melbourne for further analysis. All the children in the upper grades of the school participated, and altogether in the Haddon area 49 samples were collected and analysed. Some of the data was quite incredible, with very high salt readings being collected, while the majority of data showed that salinity may not be a problem in areas such as dams.
There's a fair bit in Haddon. It ranges from about 50 to about 9,000.
Geology students from the Ballarat College of Advanced Education conducted research within the Haddon area to discern the presence and extent of salting. Salt readings were taken from various auger holes. Tolerance readings ranged from between 4,000 to well over 6,000 parts per million. Oats, wheat and barley can survive in up to 3,500 parts per million. Ryegrass can survive in up to 1,500 parts per million, and clovers can survive in up to 500 parts per million. Salt levels within Haddon are well beyond acceptable levels and represent a considerable threat.
Still in a fairly early stage compared to some of the cases in north and northwestern Victoria, but it's equally important to do this sort of work in such an area to try to identify problem sites before they get as bad as that, because once they do get as bad as they are in some other parts of Victoria, it's very hard to combat the problem.
The hilly regions out of Haddon are extremely susceptible to taking in water down to the groundwater table. This is because of the sandstones have been folded and fractured, and the water seeps in down through the fractures down to the water table. From the research that has taken place out there this year, we have found that the water table is rising. We found this out from the bore logs from the mines department, and back in 50 years ago the water table was not as high as it is now. Out at Haddon there's a series of gravels and sands, especially around the Sago Hill area, that are highly permeable and allow the water to flow very easily down to the water table.
The start of the Wadiella Creek there's a fair bit of salinity problem, and the gullies leading into that. And at the head of it, the head of the creek, which is in this area, in my area, is definitely
There's a fair bit of salinity around Haddon area, especially in the low-lying areas and along the creeks. Oh yes, we've got, quite a few acres of salinity really. Been there for, some of it's been there all my lifetime. Never worried that great deal about it, I suppose, before, because it's always sort of been there and we could never grow anything on it, so we just accepted it. It's one of those sort of things that just goes slowly, you probably don't notice it.
We have about 10 acres of salting on our property. There's little pieces cropping up here and there in different paddocks, and I think in a few years to come that we'll be seeing a bit more of it, I'd say.
So what is salinity? Put simply, it means the presence of harmful quantities of various salts in the ground. This salt is not only found in soils, but is also common in rivers, creeks and dams. The natural movement of salt is associated with the water cycle. Over the past 150 years, widespread clearing, particularly on hills and slopes, has upset the finely tuned natural water balance and is the main cause of salting. Here we have an example of how the water table, with some native trees and scrub growing on the hills. When it rains, the trees' deep roots soak up most of the rainfall. The remaining water evaporates, flows into streams or travels through surface layers and recharges the low and stable underground water. After clearing, deep-rooted perennial trees and shrubs are replaced by shallow-rooted pasture, which absorbs much less water. As the water penetrates through the ground, it causes the water table to rise. As this water rises, it brings with it the naturally dissolved salts which damage both soil and plants. In time, the low-lying land, referred to as the discharge area, will have the higher concentration of salts. As the water table continues to rise, much like an underground flood, it increases the size and damage of the discharge area. Salting can easily be identified by closely examining indicators on your land and observing changes to any area. Alex Arbuthnot of the Victorian Farmers Federation points out some of the obvious signs which you should look for.
Well, the first symptoms are probably a loss of production in growth or in crops, which are probably not readily picked up. And the next thing you see is probably a spiny rush, which is a tussock, or buckthorn plantain, which are species that are a little bit more salt tolerant. But the next thing, you get bareness of your ground, and that's probably the first thing that shows up on the farm, a bare patch.
Brian Simpson from the Conservation, Forests and Lands Department explains the noticeable changes one can observe in the land and grasses.
One useful method of determining the presence and severity of salt is by examining the presence or absence of particular plants, indicator plants that will give an idea of the degree of salting that is occurring. You could rate salting in three classes of low, moderate and severe, and this particular plant, buckthorn plantain, is an excellent plant for determining any one of these categories. It shows very pronounced morphological variation in the plant depending on the degree of salinity. This plant here is growing on the high side of a saline patch, and it's a very healthy plant. It grows erect, it has a very large flower stalk and a very pronounced flower spike. The area that this plant is growing in and the form of this plant indicates that salinity here is very low. Here in the same area, about 3 to 4 metres from the other plant I examined, we have the same plant here, the buckthorn plantain, growing in an area of moderate salting level. And we can see here that the plant is taking on a different form and a different colour as it is under stress from increasing saline levels, salt levels. And you can see the reddish tinge on the leaf, the prostrate form of the plant, and the flower stalks and the flower heads are very insignificant. They're quite altered from the previous plant we examined. This area here is becoming more saline, and this plant is a good indicator of this. On this same patch of moderate salting, we can see here the beginnings of a bare area, which now is, although it's not serious, it is exposed to wind and water and to grazing pressures. And although Haddon doesn't have any areas of severe salting as such, there is potential for erosion hazards and risks to expand as such as there are at Moonabel. So we have to take action to ensure that these bare areas are kept in check and managed, that they don't become potential future erosion hazards.
At times it can be difficult to see the difference between water-soaked areas and salt-affected ones. But remember, the salting problem occurs because of the water problem. Don't presume it's only waterlogged. Continually monitor it for the indicators. The signs to look for are any noticeable loss of production, the presence of salt-tolerant plant species such as spiny rush, buckthorn plantain, any colour change in an area, the appearance of bare patches.
I admit I've made mistakes, but I realise now with the high cost of farming, you cannot afford to make mistakes.
Planning is the key word of everything, and it's very important.
More grass you can grow on those thicker you can grow it and the more deep-rooted pastures you can grow, the more water you're going to use, and that's going to help you for sure.
But above all, you're bringing higher productivity, which means more money into the farmer's pockets.
If we can identify the recharge areas, that is where the areas where the maximum amount of water is going in, we can say, yes, that's a priority for putting trees back, or that's where we should be putting lucerne or other deep-rooted perennial plants back. And in that way we can target our energies and our limited economic resources to the areas where they're going to do the most good. The whole thrust for more trees in the landscape has been in the past seen as a conservation issue or a greenie issue. That's no longer the case in Victoria, at least. In 1981 there were 3 farm tree groups. There are now 43 farmer tree groups. These are not urban conservationists. These are aware farmers who've recognised that trees play a very important part in the Victorian landscape. We've got to do a lot more research about productive plants which can go into those recharge areas. Deep-rooted perennial plants which will use the water. At the moment we've got native trees as our best resort. We've got to be looking at things like tree lucerne or other fodder crops which can give the farmer a return and also address the salinity problem.
Well, I haven't got any doubt at all that the first step is to get a decent pasture on the farms. A pasture like the one we're standing in doesn't have any runoff, has practically no recharge. Certainly the subsoil would be drier under this than it would be on an annual pasture. Something that farmers can do, and they'll make a lot of money doing it. Really, it's a bit like an outlay of $30 an acre for pasture to pick up another $70 to $100 in extra sheep and wool production. So you don't really have to be particularly clever with figures to realise that that's good business. It's a lot cheaper way of getting extra production than buying new ground. Most areas I go into are running 1 sheep where they should be running 3 at least. All emphasis should be placed on the high country and very little on the discharge areas. There are bigger discharge areas in some places that will require attention, and saline agriculture may be something that has to be looked at. But as a general situation, people shouldn't waste their time putting a band-aid on the little problems. They should get into the solution area.
There's a massive information about salting being distributed around the country. Before you start doing things and spending a lot of money, ask somebody and find out what they have done.
It has no boundaries. Fences do not keep salinity away, does not keep salinity away. So my advice to any farmer is take note of what has happened in other areas, have a good look at your own property and get involved with land care community efforts.
The VFF has at the moment a suggestion to the branches that they form land management committees. The Salinity branch at the moment has a conservation and salinity committee. Different land care groups will have different priorities because they've been started by different types of farmers, or may have even been started by hobby farmers. But in general, I know this is a land care area here, and there's been a tremendous response to handling the difficult hill country that we have here.
As to land care groups, I reckon they're an excellent idea, because if you can get 3 people talking about something, well, some good will come out of it.
A group like that's probably got a chance of getting more government help than just individuals, haven't you?
Small and large property holders, whether they are hobby farmers or traditional farmers, need to look at the problem instead of themselves and their size of operation. We all need to contribute towards the solution as quickly as we can without looking at who we are rather than what the problem is.
If you're wondering why the head and land care group's so worried about salinity, we've seen it in other areas and it's a disaster. We believe in this area that it's at its early phase and that it can be tackled. There's various ways of tackling it. You can plant trees, you can improve your pasture. Both those are good anyway. Planting trees as windbreaks is good for the way you live and it's good for your stock. Pasture improvement's the same. Both these are very effective methods in tackling the salinities here, and as I said, it's at its early stage. We can still do things to fight it. That's why the land care group's interested in helping farmers to do that. But we don't want to lecture to them. They've been farming for a lot longer than we've been here. They've been farming for generations. But we do think we can supply the information that they can act on to make the environment around here better for everyone, both now and in years to come.
Adults around anywhere really know about salinity, and I think they should be made more aware of it.
This area around here has only started to become evident in the last 4 or 5 years. It's something I can't afford. I want to exist in this area and live in this area as long as I possibly can and pass on the land to my family.
I think they've got a good future. We've had bigger problems than this in Australia.
If nothing is done, there'll be thousands and thousands and thousands of acres go out of production, people off the land. And if something is going to be done, which we know it is going to be done, it's certainly going to have to be done on a large scale.
Been the complete clearing of properties without any thought to the future. Now, more and more farmers are realising that if trees are cleared, to replant, allow for regeneration. But I do stress the fact that to please cooperate.
It's definitely a long term. It's something that's not going to be rectified overnight, this whole problem. There's a lot of work, and it's a lot. Well, you'd work away for a lifetime, and there'd still be a lot that you could do.
I feel, and it has to be a community effort, and with everyone pooling their ideas and resources, hopefully we can control the problem.
We might not see a dramatic change, but our children and that might.
We've got to pass on the ground, or pass on the land here to the next generation, to the next people that buy it off us or whatever, in as good a state, or if not a state, the way we received it. I'm going to reap the fruit that I sow.